Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. I'm Arthur Brooks, President of the American Enterprise Institute, and I'm honored to welcome you to the first annual Walter Berns Constitution Day Lecture. The Constitution Day Lecture Series is named for our distinguished colleague, AEI Emeritus Scholar Walter Berns. He is no stranger to any of you. He's a good friend of many of yours, and he's here with us today in the front row with his wife, Irene. Walter dedicated his career as a scholar to explaining and defending the Constitution. This is something that virtually everybody who understands the Constitution in this country knows, or at least who's done any serious study of it. By honoring his work with this lecture series, we're trying to demonstrate AEI's commitment to our long tradition of constitutional scholarship and to strong but constitutionally limited government. To inaugurate this lecture series, we've invited another constitutional scholar of great eminence, and that's Michael McConnell. Professor McConnell is the Richard and Frances Mallery Professor and Director of the Constitutional Law Center at Stanford. He's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, and he's currently a visiting professor at New York University's School of Law. His topic this afternoon, spending, public debt, and constitutional design, is obviously a very timely one, given the debate over our country's fiscal future and the impending, depending on if you're an optimist or a pessimist, the future of our fiscal life, which is either a disaster or an apocalypse. Where it's obviously something that we're thinking about a lot, and the impact of public spending on our national character is equally important. There's a renewed emphasis on returning to our constitutional roots in America. This is something we're paying a lot of attention to, and we're glad you all joined us. Please join me now in welcoming Professor McConnell.
Thank you, Arthur, for that introduction and for the invitation to be here. I have to say I'm just particularly honored to be the first speaker in this lecture series in honor of Walter Berns, whose scholarship I have been reading and learning from quite literally since the beginnings of my undergraduate education. And since then, over the years, we've even been on panels together. Often we agree. There have even been a few times when Walter and I have found some small points of disagreement, and those have been a little scary. But to be the first Walter Berns lecturer is a very great honor and pleasure for me. I selected the topic of spending, public debt, and constitutional design precisely because I think these are some issues that are not discussed very often. That is, of course, spending and debt are quite often discussed, but not so often the issues of constitutional design behind them. And also because, as you may have noticed, this is a presidential election year. You can tell that it's a presidential election year by the serious and sober analyses the candidates are offering for how to solve the nation's most pressing problems. Both sides, I'm happy to report, have put forward detailed plans for bringing our fiscal house into order, and the essence of the campaign is competition to persuade the people of why one plan will have better consequences than the other. The framers of our Constitution would be proud of the way our democratic political system is working. Just joking. This year, the United States government will spend approximately $3,563,000. Over the last 3 years, federal spending has soared to peacetime record levels of over 24% of GDP. We are borrowing 40 cents out of every dollar of that $3.5 trillion. For 4 years in a row, the federal deficit has exceeded $1.1 trillion. Now, these annual deficits are beginning to add up. As our two great political parties conducted their national conventions, the accumulated federal debt reached a total of $16 trillion. Now, everyone agrees that this cannot and must not continue. The word du jour is unsustainable, which my handy political glossary defines as meaning that the problem is too hard to solve and we really don't even want to talk about it. What concerns many Americans most is not just the spending and the taxing and the borrowing and the debt, but the political paralysis and ineptitude with which it is greeted. At one great political convention, the debt clock was prominently featured, which was a sign of a certain level of seriousness about the problem. And the party clearly has some ideas about what it is necessary to bring it under control. But did they explain those ideas to the American public? Did they begin to build the political argument for taking serious action? Did they make clear what they would actually do about it? Not so much. But that was the responsible party. For the other party, the spending is treated as if it was a virtue. The burgeoning debt, well, that's somebody else's fault, and the deficit scarcely was acknowledged as a problem. The nation is headed for fiscal catastrophe, but it scarcely warrants attention at the national convention of our largest political party. Worse yet, the Senate has deliberately refused to pass a budget for the last 3 years, despite its legal obligation to do so, and Congress has not passed a single appropriations bill for the fiscal year that starts in just over 2 weeks. Apparently, they are afraid that if they revealed their plans for federal spending, the voters would not like what they see, so let's not budget at all. This systematic inattention to fiscal problems makes many of us wonder whether ordinary democratic politics is capable of dealing with issues of spending and debt. Maybe, just maybe, we have a structural failure of constitutional dimension. And indeed, looking around the globe at our fellow Western democracies, we are not alone. With a few honorable, and I have to say surprising, exceptions, Canada, for example, and even Sweden, I understand, maybe a few others, Western democratic governments are drowning in sovereign debt with little or no sign of political resolve to do anything about it other than maybe to ask for bailouts from the central banks and the stronger economies. Spending and debt are quintessentially political issues, one might think. Political, not legal. Political, not constitutional. But is that necessarily so? Just yesterday, the German Constitutional Court handed down one of the most significant decisions in its history, upholding the European Stability Mechanism over the constitutional claim that it yields German sovereignty to institutions that lack the essential attributes of democracy. In Germany, there is no doubt that issues of public debt raise high questions of constitutional design. And just last June, our Supreme Court handed down possibly the first decision in its history holding that the spending power under the United States Constitution is limited by principles of federalism. So I want to talk about spending, public debt, and constitutional design in the United States Constitution. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 2 allows Congress to borrow money on the credit of the United States. It imposes no limit, but note that granting this power to the legislative branch denies it to the executive. Under the unwritten British Constitution prior to the Glorious Revolution, the king could borrow money as a matter of his own prerogative authority, which kings frequently did with disastrous results. The British experience in the century prior to our Constitution suggested that parliamentary control over borrowing was a real and substantial and effective check on excessive public debt. And so the framers imitated that. Some people thought last summer that President Obama should raise the debt ceiling on his own authority, which would have violated this fundamental constitutional principle. But Obama is only President of the United States. He is not King Charles II. Now, some among the founding generation would have imposed more strenuous limitations. Jefferson argued that the federal government should have no power to borrow, which would have been an effective balanced budget amendment. More precisely, in a 1790 letter to Madison, Jefferson argued that no generation has the right to impose debt on a subsequent generation. No man, Jefferson wrote, can by natural right oblige the persons who succeed him to the payment of debts contracted by him. He went on with the following example. Suppose, Jefferson wrote, Louis XV and his contemporary generation had said to the moneylenders of Genoa, "Give us money that we may eat, drink, and be merry in our day, and on condition you will demand no interest until the end of 19 years. You shall then forever receive an annual interest of 12 5/8%. Don't know where he got that number. The money is lent on these conditions, is divided among the living, eaten, drank, and squandered. Would the present generation be obliged to apply the produce of the earth and of their labors to replace their dissipations?" Jefferson answered his own question, "Not at all." Now, Jefferson was on to something. Democracies are subject to the temptation of looting the income of future citizens. Voters today may have some solicitude for the welfare of their grandchildren, but not as much as they have for themselves. Borrowing money for current expenditures and adding it to the public debt is, as Jefferson recognized, nothing other than robbing the future of their equal rights. Future generations will have all the needs that we have for defense, social spending, education, health care, and the like. It will be no easier for them to finance their current expenditures out of current taxation than it is for us. But on top of those burdens, our children and grandchildren will have to pay the interest and maybe even the principal on the $16 trillion of public debt that we have run up through our failure to get our budget in order. But future generations cannot vote. Current voters, current taxpayers benefit by spending now and passing the bill to the future, making democracy peculiarly incapable of protecting against this problem. The underfunding of public pensions is a particularly egregious example. Speaking now as a new citizen of California, I have a special interest in this. Future pensions are part of the pay of current public employees, and the cost of future pensions should be treated as part of the cost of current operations, paid for out of current taxes. The practice of underfunding pensions is nothing other than asking future generations to pay for our police, teachers, firemen, and road crews. Jefferson would ask, why should they? If we believe that constitutions should be drafted to protect against systemic democratic maladies, Jefferson would seem to be right that we need to use constitutional devices to protect future generations who cannot vote from being sacrificed to the interests of current voters. Balanced budget provisions are not merely an attempt to enshrine a particular economic philosophy into constitutional law, something I disapprove of, but a way to counteract an inherent bias of democracy in favor of the present at the expense of the future. But Madison had an interesting and compelling response to Jefferson. Some expenditures, he pointed out, are incurred for the benefit of future generations. Madison pointed to the cost of repelling a conquest. Now, he might have pointed to such things as purchasing Louisiana, which was done by borrowing, except that he was writing in 1790 and not in 1803. When government purchases a physical asset that will yield benefits for many years to come, there's nothing wrong with spreading the cost over those years of benefit. And the way to do that is through incurring debt. If governments cannot borrow for the purpose of infrastructure and other assets, then the same democratic preference for the present over the future would lead to significant underinvestment. When I was a junior lawyer in the Office of Management and Budget in the early 1980s, I was tasked with drafting a sensible balanced budget amendment, or rather several possible variations. The most difficult aspect was trying to incorporate Madison's insight that the purchase of valuable physical assets should be an exception to the rule. The trouble is that almost any expenditure can be called an investment and be characterized as producing future benefits. In principle, abusive borrowing is a proper subject for constitutional design, but it is very difficult to get it right. And then there was Hamilton. Hamilton, the most sophisticated economist among the major founders, recognized, as Jefferson and Madison did not, that public debt at a manageable level can serve the macroeconomic interests of the nation by supplying a store of value, an easily transferable medium of exchange, in short, a money supply. It is probably not in the national interest for the public debt to be zero. U.S. Treasuries, effectively risk-free assets, at least for a while longer, are vital for just the reasons that Hamilton foresaw. Moreover, a growing economy requires an ever larger pool of treasuries as a medium of exchange, so a balanced budget is probably not quite desirable. As long as the budget stays on average below the rate of growth of the economy, the public debt will be a public blessing, to use Hamilton's language, and not a curse. But can you imagine drafting a constitutional amendment which is not a balanced budget, but rather a 2% deficit amendment? The whole thing begins to look a bit complicated and ludicrous. But alas, the deficit today is careening towards 7% of GDP, which is a different matter altogether. Economists tell us that when sovereign debt exceeds 90% of GDP, ours is currently in the low 70s but rising fast, economic growth slows, interest rates rise, and it is very difficult to recover from the spiral. Ask the Greeks if you do not believe the economists. And finally, Keynesians will say that it is important to allow the federal government to engage in counter-cyclical fiscal policy, incurring debt in bad times and running surpluses in good. I'm not sure whether I believe that, but even if I did, I would note that Keynesianism in practice seems to justify deficits in bad times, but to tolerate deficits in good times as well. The United States has run a surplus for only 5 years out of the last half century, an era of unprecedented economic growth. Times never seem to be good enough to take away the punch bowl. So in principle, again, constitutional design probably could and should address this issue of public debt, but getting exactly the right policy is an exceedingly difficult problem. But what about spending? Most people regard the spending power as a plenary power limited only by the political process. The founders would have been surprised at this. Spending from the national treasury presents a classic collective action problem, the veritable tragedy of the commons. Everyone who benefits from the spending gains a great deal while suffering only a tiny fraction of the burden of taxation to support it. No one will apply cost-benefit analysis to their own political demands because the benefit to them will greatly outweigh the cost to them, even if the benefit to them is negligible in comparison to the total cost. This is an obvious problem which the founders as practical politicians surely understood. No one at the founding, indeed no one for the first century of the Republic, as far as I can tell, thought that Congress had unlimited discretion to spend on whatever it wished. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 limits Congress's use of the tax funds to promoting the, quote, general welfare. Today, that phrase has little or no meaning, but the term had actual limiting content at the time. There were two competing interpretations. Madison argued that the, quote, general welfare was a quick way of saying that Congress could spend money only in service of the other enumerated federal powers. He had some support for this in the language and accepted interpretation of the Articles of Confederation. I have to say, though, that as a matter of ordinary English usage, this interpretation strikes me as far-fetched. Hamilton, in his report on manufactures, argued that the term general distinguished between genuinely national and merely local purposes. Thus, to be legitimate, and I'm quoting now from Hamilton, the object to which an appropriation of money is to be made must be general and not local, its operation extending in fact or by possibility throughout the Union and not being confined to a particular spot. So in the founding period, the word general was used more precisely than we use it now. It was a term used for matters pertaining to the Union as a whole. Thus, they spoke of the general government rather than the national government, and of general as opposed to local concerns. Hamilton's position was thus based on the ordinary meaning of the text. Under Hamilton's interpretation, the clause addresses the collective action problem on a geographical basis. If merely local purposes are excluded, there will be no scrambling by particular representatives of particular places for maximum exploitation of the common fund. This may be an incomplete solution to the problem. There may be other forms of the tragedy of the commons than geographical, but it does address one important slice of the problem in a republic where representatives are elected on a local basis. Hamilton's interpretation of the clause finds support in an interesting debate at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Benjamin Franklin made a motion to give Congress the power to construct canals, a motion Madison supported on the ground that the canals would foster, quote, easy communication between the states, unquote, and promote economic integration in tandem with the political integration that the new Constitution would bring. The immensely shrewd and practical Roger Sharman objected, saying that the benefit of these canals would accrue to the particular states involved while the cost would fall to the United States as a whole, an objection that many delegates apparently found persuasive. Franklin's motion lost 8 states to 3. It seems likely that the general welfare condition on the spending clause reflected the same distaste for allowing the general treasury to be tapped for localized benefit. Now, in a moment, I'll argue that this principle provides a partial solution to some of our contentious modern debates over spending, but first, how did it work? The first appropriations statute in 1789 contained no specific items. In its entirety, you may be interested to know, in its entirety, it appropriated $137,000 for the War Department, $190,000 for repayment of certain Treasury warrants, $96,000 for veterans' pensions, and $216,000 for what's called the civil list, which means everything else. That was the budget. But the second appropriations statute in 1790 contained one specific appropriation, namely for the construction of a lighthouse on Cape Henry in Virginia. Now, this seems to present the same problem as Franklin's canals, and the proposal set off the nation's first constitutional debate over the scope and meaning of the spending power. Following Madison's approach, the lighthouse might be defended as, quote, incidental to commerce, or possibly in service of a navy when we got a navy. But what seemed to be decisive is the fact that the lighthouse had been authorized the previous year in a statute that would federalize all lighthouses, beacons, buoys, and public piers up and down the eastern seaboard. In light of that statute, the Cape Henry Lighthouse was part of a unified project that served the general welfare and not just local interests. To punctuate this distinction, in the same year, Congress refused to fund the removal of obstructions to navigation in the Savannah River. That project was alone, divorced from any general legislation. Now, perhaps the clearest example of this interpretation of the clause was President Andrew Jackson's veto of an appropriations bill to build a road from Maysville, Kentucky to the Ohio River. a stretch of highway entirely within the state of Kentucky, coupled with his approval of an appropriations bill for the Cumberland Road, also known as the National Road, which linked the eastern seaboard with Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. The National Road fell even within Jackson's grudging interpretation of the general welfare. This idea did not mean that Congress must always allocate funds evenly among the states, but that its spending decisions must be based on criteria that, to use Hamilton's words, extend in fact or by possibility throughout the Union. Now, distinctions of this sort may not be judicially administrable. Distinctions between general and local are matters of degree. But for almost the first century of the Republic, these distinctions were vigorously debated and recognized by conscientious Congresses and still more conscientious presidents who took seriously their duties to enforce the Constitution. Now, what might be the significance today of a limitation of congressional spending authority to projects whose benefits are general and not local? Well, for a start, how about earmarks, which are appropriations for specific projects not part of or evaluated pursuant to any broader or more general program? Are they constitutional? Now, I'm not asking whether the courts would strike them down. Presumably, no one has standing to challenge these appropriations in court. I'm asking whether a conscientious legislator or president would regard these projects as serving a purpose that extends in fact or by possibility throughout the Union. Now, earmarks are not a large part of the budget. They were not a large part even before the current supposed moratorium. But they are a gateway drug to irresponsible spending and an invitation to corruption. When the costs of a local project, let's say for refurbishing a local park, and the benefits of the project are borne by the same set of taxpayers, we can assume at some rough and ready level that the project will not be approved unless the benefits exceed the costs. But if someone else is paying the bill, the costs do not much matter. The benefits will get all the attention. Do you think Californians would pay out of their own good money to build a high-speed rail link between Bakersfield and Fresno? Even if a project is not wasteful, it violates the terms of our national compact for the entire nation to pay for projects that benefit only one local area. That was Roger Sharman's point, which carried the day at the Constitutional Convention. Why should taxpayers all over the country fund a sewer improvement project for Modesto when other cities have to fund such projects for themselves? Hamilton espoused the broadest understanding of the spending power among the major framers, but even he would have said that modern earmarking is an abuse of our constitutional design. Now, the general welfare limitation may also provide a more satisfactory, if more radical, way of thinking about the Medicaid extension and the health care decision. You'll recall that Congress required the states to expand Medicaid eligibility to all persons, including childless adults, below 133% of the poverty line. If they did not, they would lose all of their Medicaid funding. The court, in an impressive 7-2 majority, in which Justices Breyer and Kagan joined the more conservative justices, held that this threat of a cutoff was so coercive as to be unconstitutional. Surely that is going to be a very important and much litigated precedent. But the NFIB court's treatment of the issue is, alas, anything but crisp and clear. Indeed, the court expressly declined to, quote, fix a line between permissible encouragement and impermissible coercion. It simply held that the Medicaid expansion was beyond whatever line might exist. The court framed the issue as whether a state has, quote, a legitimate choice whether to accept the federal conditions in exchange for federal funds, unquote. That question led the court to rely on a series of shades of gray distinctions. The size of the grant that would be withdrawn, whether the newly imposed conditions make the law, quote, in reality a new program, unquote, whether the states are threatened with the loss of existing funding or merely new sources of funding, and whether the attached conditions are ones that, quote, govern the use of the funds, unquote, or instead, quote, take the form of threats to terminate other significant independent grants as a means of pressuring the states to accept policy changes. Now, these considerations have a certain common sense to them, but the line problems are likely to prove intractable. Indeed, they may, in fact, be completely manipulable. It is particularly perplexing that the court distinguished instead of overruling an earlier case where Congress cut off 5% of federal highway funds to any state that did not pass a 21-year-old drinking age. The court called that a, quote, relatively mild encouragement, in contrast to the Medicaid provision, which it called a, quote, gun to the head. But the two provisions are structurally and pragmatically indistinguishable. Let me float an idea, more radical than the court's holding, but possibly more administrable and rooted in the constitutional text as originally understood. The idea may not be appropriate for judicial review, and it may not hold up to scrutiny. I'm just hoping to generate some thought about this important question. My tentative suggestion is this. If Congress may spend only for the general welfare, it would be unconstitutional for Congress to set up a Medicaid system where funds are spent in all states except for one, or only some states. It has to be a general program extending through the Union. And as with other equal access regimes, it is presumptively unconstitutional for the government to exclude anyone on account of their exercise of a constitutional right, in this case, the state's constitutional right not to administer a federal program. Now, Justice Ginsburg's dissent on the spending clause issue maintains that, and I quote, a state has no claim on the money its residents pay in federal taxes. That is technically true, but if Hamilton was correct, the people of every state do have a constitutional right, whether or not judicially enforceable, to insist that federal spending be for general purposes, meaning extending to the entire Union. It arguably violates that principle to cut off a state's residents as a means of pressuring their state government to adopt policies Congress otherwise has no authority to compel the states to accept. We must not fall into the trap of thinking that federal grants are a gift, as Justice Ginsburg misleadingly stated in her dissenting opinion. The monies are forcibly extracted from the people of every state, and the people of every state are entitled to benefit from them. That is what the court's conception of coercion seems to overlook. Now, this does not render Congress powerless to impose conditions to ensure that the funds are properly spent. Congress need not grant funds to state governments that refuse to comply with clearly stated funding conditions. But according to this theory, Congress's remedy if a state refuses to comply is not to cut the state's citizens off from the benefits of their tax dollars, but to bypass the state government and administer the program directly through federal agencies or other non-state grantees. The people of the state should not be cut out. It should be the government of the state that is cut out. The right of equal treatment belongs to the people of the states and not to the state governments. And this, interestingly, is the way Obamacare's health benefit exchanges work. If a state declines to operate such an exchange in accordance with the statute's dictates, the federal government will step in and do so in that state. This satisfies the constitutional requirement that spending be for the general welfare, because taxpayers in every state will receive the benefit. For Congress to cut off particular states and deny their citizens any benefit renders the program less than general and hence unconstitutional. Well, regardless of how any particular controversy might be resolved, and I don't know if I've persuaded you about that, I'm not quite sure I persuaded myself, I hope I have persuaded you that both the spending clause and the borrowing clause raise important questions of constitutional design based on the collective action problems that these powers present. But recent events may give us reason to doubt that constitutional design can present a real restraint on political leaders determined to rack up more spending and more public debt. Europe's constitutional design appears to prohibit bailouts of the member states and to prevent the central bank from purchasing sovereign debt. But when the political elite claims that bailouts and central bank interventions are all that stand between Europe and the abyss, those restrictions were quickly disregarded. Similarly, here, many state constitutional provisions requiring balanced budgets have been easily evaded, partly by clever devices and partly by, well, ignoring them. Who would know that California's constitution requires a balanced budget? The Budget Control Act places a legal requirement on Congress to pass an annual budget well in advance of the new fiscal year and to conform actual appropriations to the budget. In my day at OMB, this obligation was held sacrosanct and faithfully obeyed. Not so anymore. Madison warned that constitutional limits on governmental abuse would be mere parchment barriers, if not reflected in the deep structure of accountable representation and separation of powers. Anti-federalists were even more pessimistic, saying that the only real restraint comes from an active and engaged citizenry, and claimed that this was the very thing that Madison's Constitution sought to neutralize, thinking that the populace would generally favor short-sighted policies like spend now and pay later. For a few important months in 2010, an active and engaged citizenry were in the streets and at town halls demanding an end to the abuse. Spend less, tax less, borrow less, they said. Since that time, our government in Washington has spent more and borrowed more, and conventional wisdom says it should tax more as well. We've pretty much given up on constitutional design as a restraint. The general welfare limitations on federal spending are completely ignored, and the Supreme Court did not even mention them in its Obamacare decision. Will an active and engaged citizenry reemerge, and will they be heard? In the end, American citizens are the only protection that really counts. Thank you.
I think we have time for a few questions, so please just raise your hand and give you a mic, and please identify yourself.
Hi, Abe Shulsky from Hudson. On the issue that you mentioned about the Medicare extension and the question of whether that was coercive for the states and the rest of it, it seemed to me that if Congress had simply abolished the old Medicare and come up with a new Medicare that had, the extension built into it, it would have sidestepped a lot of the court's arguments, so that there really wasn't a real argument about what was how much coercion could be placed. It was merely that you were taking away something that they already had. But if you had abolished the old program, created a new program, and said take it or leave it, it seemed to me that the court would have accepted that, and that didn't seem to make much sense. I was wondering if you could, if that's correct, and if so.
Well, that was one of Justice Ginsburg's arguments, and I think she makes a good point. I'm a formalist of a sort, but some distinctions give formalism a bad name. If something can simply be done, if exactly the same thing can be done just in rearranging the boxes differently, then there's no substance to the distinction. Now, I'm not 100% sure that the majority would let that one factor carry the day. They actually address that. They say it doesn't, that what matters is the substance and not what Congress calls it. They did mention 4 different lines of distinction that made them believe that this was coercive. I mentioned those in the talk. None of them have. I mean, that may be the silliest one, but none of them is real strong. The one that they used to distinguish South Dakota against Dole, the 21-year-old drinking age case, was simply how much money is involved. And I'm sorry, that kind of I guess it's sort of Goldilocks, right? Is too hot, too cold, or just right. I cannot think that is the kind of constitutional principle that's really going to hold. What I'm suggesting is a more categorical position in which what Congress can't simply not spend in the state that won't go along. It has to do it for itself. That imposes some costs on the Congress, and thus makes it a little bit more difficult for Congress to engage in this kind of thing. But it doesn't make it impossible. It just increases the cost a little bit. On the state side, the states still will have a very substantial incentive to go along with the federal program, because it's in the state's interest. I mean, if it's a popular program, it's going to be in the state's interest to be able to administer it and to be able to tailor the program to their particular needs and to run it through their own bureaucracies and so forth. They will under what I'm proposing, if they don't want to go along with the federal scheme, they sacrifice their right to run it. But we don't have the specter of state citizens simply not being able to take advantage of what their own tax dollars have been extracted to produce. And I think that's why it appeals to me, is that it doesn't involve any of these shades of gray things. It's instead a kind of a binary structural approach to the problem.
Alex Pollock of AEI, thanks for a great talk. Does the constitutional framework you're discussing and in the understanding of the founding fathers of those principles change at all if you don't equate citizens and taxpayers? In your remarks, you seem to alternate between citizens and taxpayers, and if we get to where we are today, where at least with respect to the federal income tax, half or so of the citizens are taxpayers and half aren't, does that change the terms of this argument at all?
That's an interesting question. I think the answer is no, for purposes of interpretation of the United States Constitution. That it's always been understood that the term citizen has a different meaning than taxpayer. There have been times when citizens, that was a broader term, and there have been times when it's a narrower term, but I don't think those two terms have ever been the same. I do think that as a matter of fundamental political theory, that it makes a very great bit of difference. That there's a wonderful book about 2 years old now by James McConnell entitled A Free Nation Deep in Debt. And it makes the argument that the principal reason why Western democracies flourished and sort of got a Darwinian survival of the fittest advantage over authoritarian regimes is because when a country's creditors, their creditor class, the people who lent them money, are also the dominant political class, that produces that's a political guarantee that the country is going to pay its debts. And if everyone can be confident that a nation is going to pay its debts, then the nation is going to be able to borrow at low interest rates. This was the great achievement of the financial revolution in Britain after the Glorious Revolution. This was Hamilton's extraordinary insight that he managed to ram through, even though almost nobody around understood it, and and Jefferson, Madison actively opposed it. But this is the success. But McDonald argues that it all is rooted in this political idea that if creditors are the ones who are actually running the government, well, of course the creditors are going to be repaid. What happens when the government when the balance of power shifts to those who are not taxpayers or instead recipients of government transfer payments? We haven't seen that, and it might be a different proposition. I don't think for interpreting the Constitution, but maybe for the way the Constitution works, it's going to be different.
Thank you. Gerald Chandler. You've just nearly answered my question, but I'm not convinced by the argument that you opened with, that by borrowing now we're putting the debt on our descendants. Rather, as you just explained, when we borrow now, we borrow from people who are alive, and we're taking consumption from those, the creditors, and having consumption by other people. And if the creditors don't want to give up that consumption, they won't loan. So actually what we're doing when we borrow, we're changing who is consuming now. And of course there's a consequence later that maybe the descendants of those lenders may or may not get paid back, and they may or may not have less consumption.
Well, I guess I can't agree with that, because it is true, of course, that we are borrowing from the creditors today, but we are promising that that they or their assignees are going to receive interest and principal in the future. So, just as were you at all impressed by Jefferson's argumentum? His sort of extreme argument. What if we borrow a bunch of money and say we're not going to pay any interest at all for 19 years? We're going to spend it all. We're going to have a great time while 19 years, by the way, was Jefferson's calculation of how long a generation is. So this generation basically borrows it, spends it, enjoys it, and then who's going to pay it back? Is that not placing some kind of an obligation on the future? Unless, of course, we're going to default.
Which has happened many times.
Which has happened before, right? But
Ed Whalen, Ethics and Public Policy Center. Michael, we live in a system in which legislators rarely consider their constitutional responsibilities. Indeed, often think it's not part of their job. That's something for the courts, they think. Any ideas about how we can encourage legislators, even in areas where no one's going to have standing to challenge unconstitutional actions, to take their responsibility seriously?
The only way is if their constituents want them to and begin talking about it and ask them to. And I do think that it's helpful to point out that there are all kinds of constitutional questions which are never going to go before the courts. And it may even be, I don't want to take this very far because I believe in the legitimacy of judicial review under the Constitution, but it may even be that the practice of judicial review gets them off the hook a bit. If you take the question of aid to parochial schools. In 1965, when the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was passed, Congress, this is 3 years before Flass versus Cohen, and everyone assumed that no one would have standing to challenge federal expenditures under the Establishment Clause, right? And so the debate was taking place on the assumption that this was never going to be anything that got to court. Congress got to decide. They actually had an extremely serious and interesting debate on the subject, concluding, by the way, correctly in my view, that as long as all of the school children in America were getting the same treatment, that is to say, under the same criteria. That this was children of economically impoverished circumstances were the beneficiaries, but as long as there was no discrimination between public and private, religious and secular, that it was constitutional. Now it took the Supreme Court another 25 years or so to reach that conclusion, but the discussion was quite serious. Some of the discussion about reenactment of elements of the Patriot Act, I think, has been similarly serious. But I think Congress has to realize that their constituents care, and I think they have to realize that what they think about the Constitution in certain areas is really going to stick. And those two things don't happen very often. I wonder, should Judge Ginsburg had a question too?
I was just going to suggest that what happens when the debtors are in charge, not the creditors, is inflation. Historically, I think that's what the record shows.
Well, inflation is nothing other than default on the slow, right? Right.
As a Hamiltonian and a believer in the general welfare, I just wanted to make sure everybody understands that we have a reception following, and it's all for you. I want to thank you for joining us tonight, and I also want to thank Professor McConnell for a magnificent address. So there is a reception right outside here with wine and some goodies, I think.